Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm here again today with the second installment of my war stories. As I had mentioned in the previous video, I have finally decided to share some of the experiences that I had in 1988 um, in a conflict zone between India and Pakistan, which is called the Siachen Glacier conflict. I think it's still going on. And this one is on a lighter note, I guess. It's not a typical war story, but it's basically, literally and figuratively, the story of how poetry saved my life. So uh, I've always loved to write. Even when I was in eighth grade, I enjoyed writing Urdu poetry. So in one way that the poetry helped me while I was deployed was that for the first about 2, 3 months of my deployment, I was at a base camp, right? So if you're in the mountains and if you've done climbing or read about it or watched movies, you always know that to assault a mountain, I mean, literally, to climb it, you have to establish different base camps. In a war like scenario, all the posts that were established at the glacier, both by us and by Indians, had different base camps that basically supported the posts, that replenished any materials that they had used, ammunition, food, anything else. So I was on one of the base camps, and my job primarily at that time was to act as reserve for any of the posts above us, so that if something happens there, me and my men could uh, reinforce those posts, but also primarily to supply different kinds of goods to those posts. Now, all of us in that sector were connected through field telephones, and there was no exchange. So every time you rang the phone, everyone picked up. And then you had to tell who you want to talk to, and then that person would stay online. But I think at that time, because of the environment around me, for about 3 or 4 months, I continuously wrote. I wrote poetry. I wrote poems every single day. And at first, I reluctantly shared them with a couple of my friends on the phone, but everyone else was listening in. So after that, we stayed up all night and slept during the days. So around 6 o'clock in the evenings, I will start getting these calls. Have you written something new? And I never felt pressured, but I always enjoyed sharing whatever I had written that day with all the friends online, and it became kind of a daily ritual. So that kind of gave me a lot of solace and a lot of hope. And figuratively speaking, it also, sustained me. So that's how, in one way, poetry saved my life by helping me keeping my hope alive, and staying positive. But in also literally, how did poetry save my life? I actually published about it also in my journal, Pakistaniyat, the Journal of Pakistan Studies, but I thought I should talk about it too a little bit. So I had taken two books with me when I went into the battlefield. One of them was the collected works of Mark Twain. I don't have any reason. I don't know why I carried it. It was a heavy book, but I read all of it. But the second book that I carried with me, which is still dear to my heart, was the collected works of Faiz Ahmad Faiz, one of the great Urdu poets of Pakistan, one of the great socialist poets of Pakistan. And I think the collection had just come out in 1986 or 87, so it was pretty new to have all his works in one volume, a hardbound volume. So one night, I used to, I had a high altitude tent, and I used to read by lantern light. So I'm reading, and suddenly, I don't know for what reason, our enemies across the border, the Indians, they started shelling our posts. Now, I fail to understand even up till today, what's the point of shelling a post at night, especially when your observers can't really see where the artillery shells are landing, but they were, bombing the posts behind us and the posts on the side. And we were in the lee of the mountain. We were not even visible. So I never worried about these artillery bombardments, because if you're not visible to the enemy, how are they going to locate and shoot at you, especially with short range artillery, right? We're not talking of cruise missiles and everything else. But suddenly, and if you have been deployed and for a certain period of time, you know that after a while you can pick the trajectory of a round, an artillery shell, simply by its sound, right? I had reached a point where I could tell, listening from my tent as the artillery shells are passing above me, as to where they were headed, right? There was this uncanny thing that you developed. And the post to our right on a mountaintop was being shelled, and I heard like one round as if it had strayed from its target and it was coming at us. So I put the book down. I was reading. I put the book down right next to me and thought of putting on my shoes so that I could probably leave my tent. And I heard the shell explode. I didn't know where it had fallen, but I knew it had hit our post. Right? So I got out of my tent and I yelled at, I think I had 4 or 5 of my men at the post at that time. Rest of them were up the mountain delivering goods to different posts. And I said, let's go to the shelling bunker. So I think there were 4 of us. The only one whom I clearly remember was my Havaldar, the sergeant, Samad. It was his day off that night. So as we started moving to our shelling bunker, and one thing you learn in war is that you don't run, especially if you're in the mountains. When you're doing that, 1, you'll get out of breath, and 2, if you lose your footing, you could bring on a worse tragedy to yourself, right, than possibility of getting shot at or getting bombed. So while we were on our way to our shelling bunker, which was about 200 feet, right into the mountain, we had dug it, and I heard this sound, a shrill sound of an artillery shell above us. And somehow instinctively, I knew it was going to fall on us. And all I remember is just yelling, hit the ground. And all of us hit the ground. And, the bomb exploded. And as soon as it exploded, I asked everyone, are you guys okay? I patted myself and felt I was okay. And Samad said, no, I'm not okay. I think I'm hit in my arm. So we rushed to the shelling bunker, and, I looked at his arm. So a shrapnel piece had entered, through his clothing, and he was bleeding heavily. So I rushed back to my tent, got the first aid supplies, and we had to cut his jacket and jersey and everything else. And I could see that part of his upper bone had been shattered and he was bleeding really heavily. So I applied the first aid, the bandage and everything to stem the bleeding. And our next concern was to immediately evacuate him. So we did that. We put him on a stretcher. The 3 of us, it was a sledge stretcher. So we took him down to a meetup point with another base camp. And we called them, and they came and picked him up because I couldn't leave my post. There were only 3 of us left on it. And we came back. Sadly, Samad eventually lost his arm. But the 3 others of us who were with him, all of us, didn't even get a scratch. So when I came back and I looked at where the artillery shell had fallen, I realized that it had fallen barely 7 paces from where we had hit the ground. Now, a field artillery shell, we are told theoretically, has a 65 yard killing radius, but somehow none of us died. One of us got seriously wounded, but three of us didn't even have a scratch. Now, when I went into my tent after that, after finishing the evacuation and everything else, and my tent had a huge, gash in it. It had been ripped open. And the book that was laying against my chest, when I picked that up, you know, um, a small splinter had entered the book from one side and couldn't cross it, had lodged itself in the middle of the book somewhere. And I realized that as I had left my tent to ask the others to go to the shelling bunker, the first bomb that had exploded had already sent that splinter my way. But the book, Faiz Ahmad Faiz's book, had stopped it. And had that book not been there, it would have ripped through my heart. And so I kept that book. I don't know if I have it now or not. I don't have it here in the United States, but that is how literally, poetry saved my life. So those of you out there who read poetry or write poetry, please keep this in mind. Teach it to your students that not only emotionally can poetry sustain you and make your life better, sometimes it can literally save your life. Thank you so much for joining me. And hopefully, I do hope I'll be sharing more of these stories. And thank you for being a part of this. Thank you and goodbye.